Well, it is really a privilege to be here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity that I get to come back here and see people that I've met in the previous trips. It's really exciting to see what's going on in Texas. And as Jimmy introduced John to you, he failed to mention that he's from Austin. And so I have to live with the Texan like every day. And you may not understand that, but being from Indiana, living around a Texan is somewhat difficult at times. But what were you saying? It's not bragging, it's just Texas proud or something like that, yeah. So my interest today is to try to convince you, I'm going to hopefully plant a seed, no pun intended, that an opportunity that we have is working around this idea of urban agriculture. And I believe that the inner cities, the neighborhoods that you work in, the communities that you are involved in, can not only reverse people and have impacts, but we can reverse the land and turn it into something that will be some of the most precious land there is around. To start that, I'd like to give you a little profile of some of the issues we're dealing with. Can you see that? Is that the stage light's too bright, or is it? Food is such an important part of our families. Food is something that we gather around for family gatherings. We gather around for church gatherings. We gather around in community gatherings. Food is the sort of, in many people's view, it is the vehicle for peacemaking because it gives us the opportunity to take time, reflect, and maybe it keeps our mouth busy for a while so that we can actually listen. I don't know if that's true or not. But it has a great view. And of course, our lifestyles have taken quite a beating and discussion, obviously, about food and how we interact with that. The concept that the family meal is held in the car isn't too far off for a lot of people. Food is a major political issue. You may not be as aware of that, but there are decisions going on every day that affect our food systems. About 5 years ago, I asked my department chair if I could teach a class on urban agriculture. It was kind of fascinating to me. Didn't know a whole lot about it. So he said, sure, do it in the spring. So over the holiday break, I began to read as many books and do as much research as I could. And my wife said during that period of time, she said, why are you so depressed? I don't understand. You're on vacation, you know, you should be relaxed. I said, I'm reading about our food system. It scares the snot out of me. I had no idea. And that concept that the political involvement, the control over food systems is something that's very, very concerning to me. And there are decisions being made constantly that affect that. Of course, those decisions include things like ketchup is a vegetable, political decisions that have been made. Again, standards that are put out that aren't necessarily based on maybe what would be the best nutrition, but oftentimes are guided by corporate decisions on what is the best for those corporations. If you track the regulatory processes and the interface between Monsanto and FDA and agriculture and all that, you get a little worried because it just seems like they just keep trading places. It doesn't matter the political bent on that. We have real issues with the food system, even the food we get. I grew up on the first generation. My father had grown up on a farm. My mother had grown up on a farm. He went off to World War II, came back and began working in a factory. My mom worked in a restaurant. So I was the first one that didn't have farming, although my one grandfather still farmed and I would help out as a young age on it. But I can tell you growing food then is very different than the nutritional food today. And if you want to track that, you'll see that there are some estimates that the food we eat today is about 50% of the nutrient value that we had 50 years ago. It's a constant decline. That's because of policy decisions we've made and because of agricultural practices that are in place today. What is in our food system? This is a really big topic, and if you followed any kind of food movements, and obviously Austin is at the center. This is a great foodie city, as they say, because there's a lot of people very concerned about that. Mothers are asking questions, what should I be feeding my children? What's in this? Why can't I get a label that tells me what chemicals are in this food system? Why does our food system have chemicals that are banned in other countries? What's the correlation between cancer, Alzheimer's, and other diseases that seem to be first world issues? Is there a correlation to the food? And I think a lot of us would say that there is. As Jimmy mentioned, in case you didn't know, Ball State's in Indiana. We are a border to the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes, of course, one of the largest freshwater basins that there is. We're in an area that had very large aquifers that are dwindling daily because of agricultural, again, practices. One of my colleagues at Ball State studies the fish in the Great Lakes and has determined there are three main pollutants with the fish, and you shouldn't eat them. Especially if you're female and you intend to have children, because of mercury, because of ibuprofen, and now because of birth control. They're not quite sure what birth control residue that's in the fish is going to mean to the species. That's so new, and it's because the water treatment systems weren't designed to handle those kinds of toxins. What that means to the fish means that we're finding some really strange things. I don't believe God had any three-eyed fish that I'm aware of. That's part of his strategy. So these are issues that kind of go by sort of just not noticed. And it's concerning to me that we have this going on. The model we live off of is this. I live in Indiana, in which confined feedlots where chickens and pigs and cattle are given barely enough room to even move around and are basically fed things that God never intended them to feed, to eat, just simply so that they can get fat enough to the market to be able to sell quickly. Okay? And have to be, because of those confinements, have to be given antibiotics and all kinds of things just so that they won't all spread diseases in that context. I suggest that you look at some documentaries if you're interested. The one I show to my students is called Fresh. There's a great farmer in there, Joel Salatin, who's from Virginia, a great Christian man, who probably articulates the message about agriculture as well as anyone I know. If you get a chance, watch that video, get a chance to hear Joel. He's a national speaker. Please look it up. Go to YouTube. You can listen to him. But one of his points is you should know your farmer just like you know anybody else. You should know where your food's coming from. Most of us may know our barber or our hairdresser, or whatever that might be, but do we know the farmer who's providing the food that we eat? And shouldn't we? Why not? This model is the wrong model. And it's the model that's taking us through a very sort of reductive, destructive period of time. A big part of that is what we are doing to the planet around air pollution. China has vast areas of its country in which bees cannot live. and they hire migrant workers to come in. And yes, that is a cigarette with a filter to pollinate the plants. Okay? Can you imagine that job? Who wants to sign up for that job? I want to be the pollinator with a cigarette that I'm dipping into a bottle to try to pollinate plants. Vast areas that bees cannot live in. Now, it's not just China. In Indiana, one of my close friends, a retired pastor, is one of the premier bee experts in the state of Indiana. Eldon had 8 hives about 3 years ago. And the spring planting period in which the farm next to him, the corn was put in, and the corn was treated that year, especially a genetically modified corn, to offset the droughts we've been having in Indiana, so that the corn seed could grow better without moisture, come to maturity faster without moisture. He lost 6 of his 8 hives from the residue that got just simply in the air and landed on the clover and the other fence rows and other things. Took the bees to Purdue, our land-grant school, and they said, yep, the bees died because of that. Sorry about that. Do you know how important bees are to our food system? They're really, really critical, unless you plan on hiring people with cigarettes to go out and pollinate plants. Not something that we should be aspiring. That's not the kind of work program that I would be interested in. The genetically modified. Now, it's interesting. I come from a state in which everyone who's ever driven through Indiana will go, oh, look, you're a big agriculture state. There's just miles and miles of corn and soybeans. And it's an amazing amount of land that's dedicated to that. None of that is really producing anything for the food system. Yes, it's being used some for ethanol. Yes, some of it's going into primarily corn syrup. That's the way it enters our system in terms of the food. I think this is an interesting cartoon. Let's just get rid of all those, just go ahead and start drinking corn syrup straight and eliminate the sort of process. Dilute it with a little club soda maybe. But the idea is that we're producing systems that are not sustainable, that can't lead us into the future. Most of us have accepted legislation regarding nicotine and the effects that nicotine and cigarettes have had on our health. How many of us are willing to put that same kind of regulation on sugar in our diets that are leading to so many of the diseases? You're dealing with that probably as much as anybody in your neighborhoods for childhood obesity, diabetics, and issues of health related to that. It has obviously huge medical implications. We finally understood that with cigarettes. It's time we wake up with our whole food system. You look at the obesity rates and what's going on. This is not new to you. It's very clear. And for most of us working in the neighborhoods that you're working, there aren't any other choices. The food that's there is out of the yellow food group. You know what the yellow food group is? It's Twinkies, it's sugar pops, it's all the things that have those chemicals in them that are part of, again, access at the local variety store. Food security is a huge issue. And the idea that this system is very vulnerable is quite clear. It's interesting to me that California has approximately had 1 year left on its reservoirs, and approximately 5 to 6 years on its aquifers. What was $50 for a farmer, $50 an acre foot of water, is now $800. Okay? That's huge implications because of California's amount of food it's producing for us is amazing. Food security is talked about as the idea that there's three pillars: significant quantities of food available on a consistent basis, having sufficient resources to obtain that. I have to be able to afford the food. And it's based on the fact that it's got to be something to it and something of nutritional value. Now that doesn't seem like it should be that difficult, but because the way we've been working this system and the way it's developed, it's created huge gaps that we all know as food deserts. Areas in the city, in our communities, where people cannot get to fresh food. It's all processed food. This became aware to me a long, long time ago. I began working. I started a lot of the community development work I did with Habitat for Humanity. And I had the opportunity to help Habitat write the AmeriCorps program it did in the early 90s, which was great because it got me into cities all over the country working with that program. But we started that program in a neighborhood called Sandtown. Now that neighborhood probably wouldn't mean anything to you normally, but you probably all became aware of it last March with the apprehension of Freddie Gray and what happened in that area and that neighborhood following that. So one of the things I did early on taking Ball State students, I wanted to take our white suburban rural kids who had never been out of, Timbuktu, Indiana, into an urban setting. And because of the relationship I developed to a couple there, Alan and Susan Tibbles, who are heroes of mine, just like Jimmy and Janet are, who had moved into the neighborhood and made all this difference, we began taking the students to the local grocery store. What the students were amazed at, and this is back when they still had labels on cans, how many cans didn't have labels? And peaches were written across it with a marker. And when you got home, maybe you got peaches, maybe you got green beans. It depends how good they were at transferring the information from a label that fell off to not. They couldn't believe that bananas that were black were 3 to 4 times more expensive they would be when they were normally ripe. And I said, well, look, this is a chain grocery store. When it starts to go bad in the suburbs, where does that food go? It goes into the inner city grocery store and its price is raised. Okay? That was an understanding we have to get across as to how we treat the poor and how our food system works in those situations. I know climate change is something that Christians do not want to talk about in many circles. And it's really, I'm going to make a case why that's unfortunate and why it's something that we all need to understand, and we'll talk more about that. But the predictions aren't good when it comes to food. And when you look at climate change impacts, if you look at the places in the world that are going to be the hardest hit, guess who's the most vulnerable? The poor. And so whether you believe it or not, it's a reality. And I'll travel with John and I across the country to Africa, Central South America. We see the implications of changes. Huge changes going on. This food security means we have to begin to change that system and understand that in order to have viable communities, we have to have access to good food. We're deforesting, we're overgrazing. My colleague John works a lot in Brazil. What's happened in Brazil of deforesting to sell cattle to the Americans is unbelievable. And this idea that we're a global food system is a farce because it will break down at any moment. And it is not the system that we can depend on or should live for. You see the changes. I believe you're going through a drought period here. You had huge amounts of rain, though, earlier. It's amazing how these cycles of 100-year floods and things keep coming back and over and over. We have the hungriest planet ever. There are more people living in poverty today and living without food than ever before. We actually have as many people facing obesity as we have people who are undernourished. The problem in general isn't that we don't create enough calories to feed everybody on earth. It's that we choose not to distribute it, and we choose in the U.S. to waste 40% of our food. You add to that those practices, those chemical practices, the continued reuse of planting the same products to the point that our soils are depleted. We have to add nitrogen. We have to add all these chemicals to it. And then we have to change the seeds, modify them so that they'll work with the new chemicals so that they can grow, as opposed to it being a natural process of changing out the crops, rotating those. If any of you have farming backgrounds, you rotated your crops. You rebuilt the soil continually because the soil is the very foundation, obviously, that is the food. Our soils are worthless. Oil. Not the right state to talk about oil, I know. But one of the things that became alarming to us is about a year and a half ago we began to get reports on what's happening with the food, which there's a great foods of apples and things out of the Northwest that no longer had room. There was no more room on the trains for food. The tar sands oils and the oil companies coming out of Canada were buying up every car, every slot on the railroads, and they pay much more than the apple farmer does. And so food was being dropped. Harry and David, as one company, had to totally transform their distribution system because they no longer could ship to the Midwest through trains and then redistribute that. Huge implications on that. Okay, I got everybody depressed. Here I feel like, give me a banana and just stick it in my ear, I'm done. This is the greatest opportunity we've ever had in the history of the church. I am pumped because we can change it. And I believe the church needs to be the one leading the change. See, God had a strategy. That may be hard to stomach. But God had an idea that when he put two people in the garden, every one of their needs would be met. That he had the ability to grow things at multiple times the input. And by the way, that includes all medicines. It's really interesting when you start to think about how God does that. Oh, by the way, there's lots of cool scripture on this. Okay? When in doubt, go to scripture. You know, can't go wrong with using scripture in your presentation. If you don't believe me, at least believe God, okay? Or whoever wrote the particular passage. I believe that we need to return to our understanding of what God created, the creation systems. They're not natural. They're created. They're created by God. It wasn't some sort of, oh, what do we have today? That seems like a logical thing to happen. No, God had everything blueprinted and laid out. Creation systems. Stop using natural system. Use creation systems. It's with a capital C because God was involved in it. It's an amazing system. If you could ask the birds and the beasts of the land, they would tell you. They would proclaim how great that system is. They'd tell you how screwed up it all is by man, but when they have the opportunity, they love because creation system works. I'm going back to that, by the way. It's called fall. Have you guys ever heard of that? I don't know. It's freaking 90 degrees here, and what's going on here? We changed the color of the trees and things like that, okay? So I go back and I get to drive around and go, That's cool, God. I love that color. I'm glad you did that. We have no idea how you did that yet. We haven't figured out how leaves change colors and do all that. We have some guesses, but we don't really know how you did it. But it was really cool, that red maple that you did green this year. That was fun. The heavens praise him. We have songs about this, I think. We talk about it. But do we believe it? Do we practice it? Can we apply this to an inner city neighborhood somehow and think about, yes, those are beautiful scenes, aren't they? Wonderful, sort of idyllic kinds of imagery. But I want to argue that same beauty can be found in our communities if we look to creation systems. I don't know if we can get any puffins in or not, but we'll try. Hurry, because most of the glaciers are going to be gone. So if you want to see those, go in a hurry. I love just the idea that the nature makes sound, makes songs. And if you go for hikes and you go into woods, you often, if we listen and aren't plugged in, we can hear those sounds and the beauty of all that. Science at one time was totally in sync with the pursuit of God. There's quotes up there, there's other ones, but early scientists, early people exploring the earth were doing it with the belief that in doing that they would discover and learn more about God. It's an amazing concept. And it's one that we need to continue to embrace. Let's not run from science. Let's not ban science. Let's embrace it and bring it back to what it was originally intended in that pursuit, the pursuit of understanding God. And there are plenty of scientists out there who do that. I love Albert Einstein. If you Google Albert Einstein and faith or God, he's got like 100 quotes, all kinds of them, about what that means. The more I study science, the more I believe in God. That has to be something we understand. The problem is we've taken this approach to science that's a reductive approach. To get to that GMO seed, we narrow things down to the point that we forget about its big implications. I'm so focused on that seed growing without less water that I don't care that bees die or that it impacts the complexity system that's there, that creation system. I'll make an artificial bee or something. That's the engineering school can figure out what the agriculture school screws up. We have to understand these systems. They're amazing. They're just amazing. They're so complex, we don't even begin to understand them all yet. But when we return to an understanding that they are all part of what God created, it frames it completely different for us. Now, I grew up I'm so much younger than Jimmy. I grew up in that, I heard about the hippies. I was too young. But I heard about how, and I listened to people at the church go, well, we won't have anything to do with environmentalism because the hippies and the Mother Earth people are in charge of that, so we're going to just stay away from it. We should own it. It's not Mother Earth, it's Father's creation. That's what it is. And that's what we ought to try to take back. Who cares about Mother Earth news? I want Father creation news. I want to celebrate everything cool that he does in creation through science and other activities. This is the man that I tried to struggle with understanding all this, that depression, that I found to be an amazing man of God. Now, you may not know that because a lot of his stuff was edited. Most of his speeches and most of his comments were edited out in the New York Times. But George Washington Carver was a tremendous man of faith. He started every day with a very simple prayer. Lord, in your creation, show me how to feed my people. Lord, every day I pray that in your creation, I can provide and heal people. Lord, in your creation, show me how we can provide for people. Economics, health, and food. Carver wrote, God laughed at him. He said that what God said to him was, you can't handle it all, George. I'm not going to show you all of creation. I'll make you a deal. I'll show you what you can do with the peanut and the sweet potato. 140 products with just those two pieces of creation that met all focused on meeting that prayer. I stole that prayer from Carver. It's my prayer every morning because I think it's a cool prayer. I think it's something we need to return to. We need to own this sustainability movement. How do you get an ROI better than this? One seed producing 400 to 500. I don't care what Wall Street thinks he can do or Donald Trump thinks he can do. I think if God can do a 1 to 400, that's a pretty good thing ROI. And maybe we ought to try to figure that out and follow his laws as to how we do that. Not so bad. I think God modified may be the right way to go. Maybe we should change that GMO to be God modified or God not modified approach to it all. I was at a conference in Bristol, England, and it was a conference about cities and making them more livable and different aspects of that. And one of the presentations was by a British landscape group that had developed a new housing division community sort of center. And I was struck by this comment that they made, and they said, and I wish I could break into a British accent, but I really can't. I'm not even going to try. We planted a bunch of willow trees because what we want is if anyone has a headache, they go out and relax under the willow trees. What's wrong with the Brits? I mean, oh, by the way, the willow bark is used to make aspirin. And the willow tree gives off all of these spores all the time. So if you have a headache, sit under a willow tree, and you'll be getting God's aspirin as part of that. That understanding is at the core. You probably know that all of our synthetic drugs that we take, they're all synthetic, come from a derivative of a plant or an animal, basically. However, the FDA says, if I can replicate the molecular change of that plant to the 8th level, we'll grant you permission to use that as a drug. God's molecular chain in that same plant is infinite. It goes infinite's a lot bigger than 8, if you're wondering. It goes on and on. And that molecular chain happens to be the same molecular chain we were made out of. So do you think there's any coincidence that syncing up things that God made with our body should make sense? Looking at that, the journey that I've been on in this process has included a gentleman who really introduced me to the healing oils. I grew up in a church. Whenever I understood the oils, it was all just some sort of hokey-pokey ceremonial. They just, were doing that. Yeah, I know that Frank sent some things to baby Jesus. I had no idea that what the wise men brought was a first aid kit. See, those oils were there to help baby Jesus fend off disease and to be healthy. Who knew it? They didn't have a pharmacy. that Mary and Joseph could run to. There wasn't a CVS on every corner in Nazareth. Those oils are very important to reestablish and reconnect. By the way, did you know that there are 1,000 more pores on your feet than anywhere else in your body? And if you want to uptake something, so feet washing was part, and applying oils was part of a process, of a medicinal process of welcoming you and helping you with sores and the things that happened as you traveled. So you wash your feet so that those pores, the dirt would be out of them, and then you'd apply the oils, which, by the way, if you want to taste anything quickly, put it on your feet. Think about that one. It's an amazing thing. I suggest you look at it at a point. Now, this is way out here. This is probably a little more Pentecostal than we want to be here in the Baptist place. But there's a group called Sentinel Group that, if you're not familiar with them, I find it very important to look at what they've done. They have some videos out called the transformation videos. See, what they've went around the world looking at is they've found places in the world where God showed up. Well, how did God show up? Well, in the Fiji Islands, in some foothills of Kentucky, in some other places, things got so bad that the churches came together. Now, that has to be really bad, right? It really has to be bad that pastors would get together and pray together, and they'd all just say, let's all call on God together at the same time. That has to be bad, right? And those places where that happened, they went in and filmed that and looked at that. Now, if you watch those videos, you might completely miss this, but because I'm on this bent about creation systems, immediately when I heard these videos, I go, well, why not? Because in the Fiji Islands, all the coral reefs came back and were restored and regenerated when God showed up in those communities. In Kentucky, in the community that had so much meth and so many problems, when the churches came together and they closed their jail because they no longer needed it, because God was transforming lives so amazingly, the bears, the deer, and the fish that hadn't been in the county for over 5 years came back. See, creation celebrates God. It's part of God. I don't worship it. I worship God with it, through it. And I understand that it's a gift from God to sustain who I am and what I can do, as Carver understood that. It's an amazing thing to look at. Now, this idea of food and moving in, now what do we do with that? This isn't new to us. We understood this better when we had world wars, that we could grow our own food and we could do something. As you probably heard, Ball State University is where John and I teach. You might recognize that B-A-L-L, because if you've done canning in your life, the Ball brothers moved to Muncie, Indiana, because there was an endless amount of natural gas. They could burn it forever. Not. Lots of water. Not. And lots of sand. Yes, we still got lots of sand. Essential for glass making. So the canning jar, which transformed the food systems, it allowed you to eat out of season. And it was really interesting. I called Jimmy up a couple years ago. Actually, I sent a picture, because in the museum at Ball State, at one of the cultural centers, is a big glass canning jar that's like a quart, like a gallon size, and it says Waco Orphanage. See, what orphanages would do, they'd have the Ball Company make them big cans, and then the orphanages would hand them out to families. So as you were canning for your own family, you canned something for the orphanage. That was your tithe. So the churches would distribute these and say, while you're putting up green beans this year, would you put up a can for the orphanage? Would you put up a can? Amazing kind of system. So we know how to do this. But we're going to do it completely different. And what I'm excited about, and I believe urban agriculture is going to be one of the most exciting things we can do. Because we have areas of our cities that have been abandoned, that nobody wants to do anything with. We have vacant lots. We have vacant buildings, except in Colorado. Every warehouse in Colorado is growing an agriculture product right now. You have to build a warehouse if you want one in Colorado. But the idea that we can really begin to rethink that. So we've developed, this is a project we did in Indianapolis, working with an inner city neighborhood. And they had already come to the conclusion that food meant a lot of things to them. For them, food meant jobs. They believed that food could begin, growing food and value adding to that could produce jobs. They wanted a co-op grocery store. They had no, while we were doing the study, the only grocery store in the neighborhood closed. The churches had to organize rides for people to get to grocery stores. They wanted co-op aquaponics, intensive agriculture opportunities. They wanted to be able to create small businesses so people in the neighborhood could be self-employed and have their own sustainable future in terms of jobs. They wanted community gardens. They wanted healthy food to combat the obesity and the diabetics and other issues in the neighborhood. So we had our foundation was already laid for us to come in there. And we begin to say, look, this is our current food, the way you're kind of eating in the neighborhood. Your hamburger's probably coming from Brazil. We have the lowest count of cattle in the history of the U.S. right now in terms of actual cattle on hoofs. Your banana came from Ecuador. Your peas came from California. You might have got your beans from North Dakota. And the only thing you got from Indiana was the corn syrup in your drink. Okay? Oh, and you had an Idaho potato. All traveling, average food in our plates. Most people, when they eat, they can look at their plate and see 3 or 4 countries represented on their plate as to where things came from. Travel over 1,500 miles in the process. We said we want to do this. We want to create a food growing system allow you to do the asparagus, the green beans, and all the vegetables locally in your neighborhood. We want to have fish as a protein source. We can grow that. We might even have some chickens. We can offset a lot of the meat and the protein by having that in the neighborhood. We can definitely do the salads and the tomatoes and all those things growing in the neighborhood. And we can even get mint from the greenhouses. We can do potatoes, and we can get a few apples going as well. We can totally transform your diet and grow it all in your neighborhood in Indianapolis. This neighborhood is like many that you come from. It's a food desert. It has problems. This is the site. We were working with a 19-acre site that was an old industrial site that had been a brownfield that had been cleaned up. And so we came in and they asked us to develop scenarios around 3 things: jobs, community, and food. So we went through a process. Some of you were in our Food Hub game we played yesterday. They were part of that workshop. And you played the game we did to try to get the neighborhood, make some decisions to bring across these ideas. So this is a typical neighborhood. This could probably be your neighborhood, the same issues that you're working in. One of the things that I try to preach, especially to economic development leaders and mayors, is that food is your best economic development weapon that you can use. See, we have a real problem in that we grow so little of our own food. It's an economic market being ready to be captured. We know that a household, that approximately 13%, 12.4% of a household income goes to food costs. It's the 3rd highest cost for most households. If you're poor, it's probably higher. And you're probably buying the really cheap stuff, dollar value meals and things, to try to stretch those dollars. In Indiana, we took the neighborhood median income and said, all right, the household income is $27,000. Taking that at just the idea of 8%, we know that that's approximately $3,500. There are 5,000 households. That's $17 million could be spent in the neighborhood. That's a lot of money. Okay? How do we leverage that? See, the problem we have in Indiana is we only produce 10% of the food we eat. 90% of the food that we eat in Indiana comes from outside Indiana. Now, if you're in a business school and you said there's a 90% market available to you on which everybody participates, as far as I know, everybody eats at some level. Now, there are people who don't, I understand that. But potentially everybody has the opportunity or wants to participate. Who wouldn't want to participate in that market? So we began to talk about if we could change that 8% and suddenly change that to 20%, this represents economic development. And it's really important for our economic development people to stop chasing industry and look at something. By the way, there's some other benefits to growing your own food. We'll get into that. Health, other parts of that. So we set up a whole discussion on ideas of intensive agriculture, putting in aquaponics, hydroponics, aquaculture systems, which are going on in a lot of cities. The idea that there is the opportunity for cafe. Obviously, Waco and Jimmy's Cafe is a great example. It provides jobs. It's a wonderful thing to have as a local place. The idea that community gardens. Now, many community gardens don't produce a lot of food. We understand that. They talk to a lot of people who organize community gardens. They go, people are just too busy talking. They're just coming out here. They just seem to want to talk. They just want to, socialize. Well, hey, that's okay. That's part of community, right? That's part of neighborhood. What a great way to reach out to people is having them come up that you can talk about your tomatoes or your asparagus or whatever that might be. A community kitchen becomes very valuable because it becomes an incubator, a business incubator opportunity. You probably have in your family something that you make that only your family makes. That could be a salsa, that could be a strawberry jam, that could be some other product that could be labeled and sold. Imagine all the micro businesses in a neighborhood with people who could cook, or you could begin to train to cook. And if you have a community kitchen, which is certified by the Board of Health, then those products can be cooked there. Can in your home kitchen, but they can in a community kitchen. So investing in these things, a grocery store, having, again, maybe a co-op grocery store that you can keep more of the money local. Having education and training around food. One of the non-for-profits that I'm on the board, we're working hard. We've created a culinary training for a lot of folks who are unable to get employment. And we become that gap, getting them training, culinary school, serve safe, because they can't get into other places because of a prison record or a drug record or whatever. So we can take them through the program, get them mentored, get them safe, serve safe, so that they can have the ability then to start some sort of employment. Hopefully that will be in our neighborhood where we can open up the cafe, where we can open up the opportunities. Food trucks. Does Austin know food trucks? I mean, give me a break. You can't go like a half a mile without finding a food truck. It's great. Other places, parts of the country, that's not true. So there's great opportunities with food trucks as a micro business opportunity. Processing, we call that value adding. The great thing about food is you can add so much to it. You not only have a raw product, but I can now add it together. I can create salsa, I can do things. There's an endless supply of things you can do with food. Urban animals, depending on where you are, you ought to be able to have some chickens, potentially have some rabbits, some other kinds of things, and they can begin woven into that process. Commercial farming. Now, this is something that's happening, and you may not be as aware of that. But there are national groups, big city farms, for example, that will come in and farm ground. In Indianapolis, they went into the Parks Department and said, you got all this land that you're not using for anything, we will farm it and we'll take the proceeds from that. Okay? That can be good. Unfortunately, big city farms doesn't hire a lot of local people, and unfortunately their revenue again leaves town. So why not us owning that business and doing that in the neighborhood as an opportunity? It's really important to do that. So we played this food hub game. We talked about all those different elements. That's the kind of tile things. We translated that, and then we began to score that and look at how many jobs it would create, how much food potential it could create, and how much of a community factor it could be. So again, food, jobs, and social indicator. All very important as part of this process. And we developed strategies with them for this 19-acre site that would be, again, based on what the neighborhood told us. So we had 3 different strategies. We talked about placemaking, how it was important to create a farmer's market, how the things, you had to have a child care center, because if you're going to have training for residents, you got to have a place for their kids to be while they're getting the training, or while they're experimenting, or while they're working in their kitchen. So you have to weave these into other services that are part of that. And just trying to begin to get the kind of investment that would be part of changing that neighborhood. And again, these are just some quick renderings, drawings we use to try to, again, put that ideas out there so the neighborhood could decide on what they want. Some of them were very heavy, in this case, on commercial farming, giving up about about 50% of the land for a commercial farmer. Then there was community farms, and then there was other farms. There's community greenhouses, things like that. We have a different climate, so greenhouses play a different role than they might here in Texas. But again, how to begin to build strategies around that. I mentioned Sandtown, and the thing that really sort of launched our efforts in this area was Sandtown. As I mentioned to you, I had been going into that neighborhood for over 20 years. One of the gentlemen that became a very close friend, or is a very close friend, is a guy by the name of Elder Harris. If you're an old-time CCDAer, he's the guy that would close the session with this little light of mine. He'd get up there, and John would always have him come up and sing that as part of that. Elder Harris runs Martha's Place, which is transitional housing for women coming out of substance abuse. In that neighborhood, West Baltimore, what they know is if women get clean but are put back in the same environment that they came out of, their chances of success are minimal. So they provide transitional housing, acclimate them back into their families, provide opportunities for them to get jobs. It's a great ministry. Many of you probably are involved in ministries like that. So what we said, we learned that the city of Baltimore had developed a competition for neighborhoods because the mayor of Baltimore said, I want every vacant lot in Baltimore to grow food or to clean water or to do both. So when we heard about this, we contacted Elder Harris. He had already started a hoop house, was doing some gardening with Big City Farms, actually. And we said, hey, we're really into this aquaponics. We got this system we really like to use because it produces 4 to 5 times the amount of food, 1/10 the water, and you can grow all year round. We think it's a huge economic development tool. How about if we enter this competition and we put out there that we'd start with a seed, a couple small greenhouses, that the women could grow the food simply for themselves, so they could learn how to grow in this urban agriculture context. The other motivation to that was we know the food coming out of this system is nutrient rich. The Brix levels, it's the best food that we've found anywhere in terms of nutrient levels and what it produces. Also, some experiences I've had in Africa around HIV and basically the drug treatment is unless the body has some sort of nutrient base in food, the drugs won't do anything, even those ridiculous synthetic drugs. So our idea was, let's get nutrient-rich food into the women so that their bodies can begin to regenerate chemically and get the toxins out of that, as well as teaching them how to eat different foods and potentially prepare. So we developed, this is a half-acre proposal. I can't see that up there, but this is the full acre lot. It's a half acre there. The reason we chose to only work on a half acre is because the city of Baltimore says that if you have an urban farm, you have to have a minimum of half acre. So we decided to make a prototype that would work on any half acre in Baltimore or any other city. Time's up. Okay, thank you. So the end result is that we developed this system, and it's going in place. It had a cafe, a training center. The women would then learn how to cook in a culinary school so they eventually could own their own food trucks. There would be a prototype food truck plaza, pop-ups, and farmers market stuff. So the idea is in this half-acre lot, all these things could be contained, and the women could eventually have full control of their future by having their own jobs, their own businesses, and be self-sufficient. And grow healthy food for the neighborhood, begin to address diabetes and the other issues. Urban agriculture is the solution we need to that. We're very focused on this system. This is Jeff Gwynn, a paraplegic, who had a motorcycle accident. He's beginning to grow food in this system, and that's after 3 weeks. It's growing amazingly, and it's Brix levels. By the way, if your Brix levels are up on your plants, insects won't attack them because natural sugars they can't digest. So if you have unhealthy plants and you have bugs, it's because your plants are unhealthy. If you have healthy plants, the bugs will move on. They're kind of like the lions that take out the weak in the herd. That's the role God made for insects, to take out the weak, genetically weak plants so we can get rid of that strain. So all these things are part of that. I think urban agriculture is our solution. Oh, by the way, I won't have time to do this. It's actually our mission value. We can take advantage of sustainability, the green movement, and we can go around, explain creation systems, and feed people at the same time, and have an amazing impact in our worlds, in our neighborhoods, at providing healthy food, economic opportunity, and cure them. All of Carver's prayer, which is the prayer that I would hope that you would take back and consider for your neighborhoods and how you might be able to use food for those same values. Thank you very much.